So first of all, thank you so much. So this is going to be a redo of my presentation at the previous Psoriasis Association's conference, now Psoriasis UK, just because we had some technical difficulties on the day. So my name is Emmanuel Toni. I'm an advanced nurse practitioner in dermatology, and I'm a PhD researcher at the Centre for Appearance Research. I've also lived with psoriasis as well for quite a few years. So today I'm going to talk to you about something that many people living with psoriasis experience, but it can be difficult to talk about openly, and that's stigma. So over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to share some of the findings from study one of my PhD and some of the broader research field as well. So first of all, just a brief note before we get started about looking after yourself. We're going to be talking about stigma and stigmatization, and it can be quite distressing for some people. So if you want to pause this, if you want to have a break, please absolutely do look after yourself. But we will be talking about stigma discrimination, some negative public attitudes towards people with psoriasis, and also some real life experience. Like I said, if you need a pause, please do pause. So before we talk about research, I'd like you to think about your own experience. Just have a moment to reflect about how many people, have you ever experienced people stare at you maybe because of your skin? How many of you are perhaps asked on a daily or monthly basis, is it contagious? How many of you have probably felt uncomfortable wearing certain clothes, maybe because of psoriasis? Usually when I do this in a room full of people, lots of hands tend to go up after those questions. Psoriasis is often described as a skin condition, but most people, and most of you listening, know that it affects so much more than skin. It can affect confidence, relationships, work, mental well-being, and how people think and how we think other people see us as well. And that's why it's really important that we try and understand stigma as best we can. So first of all, what is stigma? It's quite a broad, abstract concept. I'm going to try and keep things very simple. So it might be somebody, while researchers talk about stigma, we're simply talking about negative attitudes, assumptions or behaviours directed towards somebody because of characteristics or condition. It doesn't necessarily have to be psoriasis. There's a huge amount of things that can be stigmatised against. For psoriasis, stigma can look different for different people. It might be people staring. It might be somebody moving away from you on public transport. It might be somebody assuming you don't take care of yourself or ask whether they can catch it. Sometimes these experiences can be very obvious. Other times they can be much more subtle, but over time they can have a significant impact. And also there's important just to highlight as well the different types of stigma. There's external stigma, but also there's internal stigma. So once you are exposed to a lot of external stimuli, you can then internal those negative attitudes and assumptions yourself and believe in them. So it's really important we address stigma. So one of the things that surprised me when I started my PhD was how little we actually knew what the general public thinks about psoriasis. There wasn't really any research within the UK where they explicitly tried to measure perceptions about psoriasis. We know that a lot of people, a lot of the experience of people living with psoriasis, which is brilliant, but we know much less about the attitudes of the public. And I think that's a fundamental flaw, because really the problem isn't necessarily, or rather the burden of research and changing shouldn't sit with people with psoriasis. It needs to sit with society, and we need to educate and change perceptions, because really that's where the problem sits. So the first question we ask is, what does the UK public think about people with psoriasis? It sounds like a very simple question, but surprisingly, it's very hard to answer. So what we did is we surveyed about 280 people, UK adults up and down the whole UK. We showed them pictures of psoriasis, which we were fortunate to get some lovely people to send us pictures. We used two different types of images. One that showed zoomed in pictures of psoriasis plaques. You might have heard of Dermatology New Zealand, those types of images. And then ones where people kindly volunteered to send in. So it might be a picture of someone doing yoga on a beach, but they might have a plaque of psoriasis visible in that image, and we called them more person-centered. So we showed these people these images and then asked them a few different surveys. We asked them to share their feelings, and we used all of this to try and build a picture about what people really think in the UK about people with psoriasis. So what did we actually find? This was the moment I was genuinely quite excited to find out, and perhaps most nervous to see. So like I said, we asked 280 people what they thought. 85% of participants agreed with at least one negative stereotype about people with psoriasis. Now, it's before we start to panic about that statistic, it's important to explain what that means. It doesn't mean that 85% of people dislike people with psoriasis or have very stigmatized belief about it. It just means that many people still hold at least one assumption or belief about psoriasis that isn't necessarily accurate. These stereotypes can be subtle, but they can also shape how people think about and respond to others. The second figure is 74%, so about 3/4 of participants agreed with at least one myth about psoriasis. And again, this tells us that myth information is still very common. Despite all the information available today, many people still don't fully understand what psoriasis is, what causes it, or what it's actually like living with it. And finally, 43%, so almost half of participants wanted to avoid at least one social interaction with somebody who had psoriasis. That could be something as simple as sitting next to someone on a bus, for example, could be shaking hands, interacting or dating someone with psoriasis. But the good news is that the majority of people did not report these attitudes. But what this tells us is that stigma hasn't disappeared. Many people living with psoriasis are not imagining these experiences. And when people tell us they've been stared at, avoided questions, or made to feel uncomfortable because of their skin, our research suggests that there is still real reason for those experiences to continue to occur. So I think these findings really do reinforce why awareness remains so important, because stigma often doesn't come from cruelty, it's more a misunderstanding. And misunderstanding is definitely something we can challenge. One of the approaches we've used that is quite new to the stigma field is what 3 words. So we asked people what 3 words would you describe people in the images. And you can see in the word cloud that the most common negative word was sad. So I should explain what we did is we coded words into physical descriptors and emotional descriptors. We felt that physical descriptors were neutral. So seeing a plaque of psoriasis and saying that looks red was decided to be neutral, whereas something like sad was seen as negative. By far, the most common words actually used were physical descriptors. So itchy, sore, or painful. But out of the negative words, you can kind of see that really it's the emotional responses that seem to be the main prevailing thing that we need to address. So the good news, the study wasn't all bad news. In fact, one of the most encouraging findings was that over 80% of participants correctly recognized that psoriasis is not contagious, which is great. 22 years ago, I reckon that statistic would have been much different. Which tells us things are improving. Public understanding is not perfect though, but progress is happening, and that's something worth celebrating. One of the other things that fits within the much larger literature field is that familiarity changes everything. So one of the strongest messages from our findings was that familiarity matters. People who knew somebody with psoriasis or a skin condition tended to hold more positive attitudes. In other words, when psoriasis becomes personal for people, stigma reduces. And I think that's really important and quite powerful, and reminds us why conversations matter. Sharing experiences and awareness does matter. Every time somebody learns what psoriasis is, we have an opportunity to challenge these misconceptions. So why awareness campaigns matter? This finding is one of the reasons my PhD is focused on awareness and social media. If increased familiarity reduces stigma, then awareness campaigns have enormous potential. So the goal isn't simply just to reach people, to teach people what psoriasis is. The goal is to help people really understand what living with psoriasis is actually like, because understanding can often lead to empathy, and empathy can hopefully lead to reduced stigma. So what we did next is we did some qualitative research with people with psoriasis. One thing I didn't mention just before is that we found that stigmatizing beliefs tended to be slightly higher in young males. So what we want to do with study 2 is to understand what it's like seeing content on social media that features psoriasis, because we don't want to do much harm or any harm, really. So we interviewed people with psoriasis, and what we found that it was a very contradictory stage, social media. So it helped to build community, it helped people to share their experience, which was sometimes cathartic. So sometimes people would go on social media to share a stigmatizing experience they had, and it felt like they were reclaiming that narrative and using it as a point of education for the general public. It helped people feel understood and not feeling alone. However, there was also a lot of information. There was comparison, both negative and positive. So some people were looking at other people with psoriasis online, seeing more traditionally severe cases, so higher PASI scores, and then recalibrating their own relationship with their skin and saying, oh, actually, my psoriasis isn't as bad as I thought, and therefore had confidence to wear shorts and things outside. Whereas other people were looking at severe depictions of psoriasis and thinking, oh God, is this my future? So it's a very difficult place to navigate. There's conflicting advice, as we all know, and also unrealistic expectations as well about what clear skin looks like. So the key message was that people wanted awareness campaigns that combined these lived experiences, but with trustworthy information as well. And this is where authenticity came through as a very important theme that we are trying to put into our campaign. So where we're at the moment. So we've got all that information from study 1. We've got all the information from study 2. So what we're now doing is we're creating the campaign. So we've got a young male content creator, so between the age of 18 to 25. He's creating a campaign where he's trying to establish a parasocial connection with the audience so that he can then educate people about psoriasis. It's not going to be a traditional psoriasis awareness campaign where psoriasis is really at the forefront and primarily discussed. Instead, this is more going to be like a content creator or an influencer's content on social media. Think of videos like a day in the life of of me, or get ready with me for a night out with friends. But we're going to be sprinkling in information of psoriasis, and what we're trying to do there is to subtly educate, but building that parasocial connection by telling that authentic story of someone living with psoriasis, and show that people with psoriasis are so much more than a condition. They are a complex human being with goals, aspirations, and that's what we're trying to get across. So we are in the process of doing that through a person-based approach using patient public involvement. We're on our, at the time of filming this, I think our 4th to 6th PPI at the moment, getting feedback, but we'll be almost done very soon to get it tested, and hopefully you'll all be seeing that in the near future. And if you have any questions, please you just send them into the Psoriasis Association. I'm sure they can send them on to me, and I'll always be happy to answer. So thank you very much.